The power panel's been listening in on that, and I want to bring them in now for some analysis and reaction to that. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communication strategist and the co-host of the Beyond a Ballot podcast. Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. Jordan Likeness is a former NDP strategist. And Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of The Hill Times. Look, a large day, a King's speech and the Prime Minister there. Sherelle, just your quick takeaway, what stood out from what Mark Carney had to say there in your view?
Well, he clearly has an ambitious agenda. He clearly has plans in his mind. I know that the opposition Conservatives say that, Mark Carney has no plan. He clearly has a plan. What is still missing, I think, for me at least anyways, is how was the method and how are you going to get there? There was an interesting comment that Bloc Québécois leader François Blanchet made today. He said he views Mark Carney as kind of like he says that Mark Carney sees himself as the CEO of Canada.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Or he's approaching it like a CEO.
Approaching it as a CEO, and he puts out the order. The provinces are the regional offices, is how Blanchet put it, and everybody else has to kind of fall in line and make things happen. And maybe that's the case, and maybe that is oftentimes the role of a prime minister as the head of government to set the direction and move forward. But I do think that people are still looking for, okay, but how are we going to get there?
Tim, what are your thoughts, your high-level takeaways?
Yeah, I just build off something Sherelle said. He is taking a different type of leadership approach than we've seen in a long time, back almost to the Paul Martin era when transformation was in until it wasn't. I'm all for what he's talking about in terms of transformation. What is fascinating to me is he seems to could care less about any political expectation management. That may be a good thing, that may be a bad thing, but it's a reality. He's setting up a real interesting set of KPIs, key performance indicators for himself. You tried to get some specific ones off of him, but he seems unencumbered by the worry that most politicians have that, I better keep things down low.
Yeah, the laws of political gravity don't scare him.
So we'll see how long that lasts, and maybe he does succeed, but he certainly set up potential challenges around expectation management.
Yeah, Amanda, that's kind of my take too. Expectations, they're above the Golden Dome, with Prime Minister Carney.
Well, nothing can shoot anything down. I was probably safe.
What are your thoughts on sort of what he said there? Because he expanded on a few things that we'll go through one by one a little bit, but your high-level takeaway there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some themes that will be really appealing to Canadians. I think we saw them in the throne speech, and they were reinforced again in this interview, this idea of how important it is to unify the Canadian economy, going from 13 economies to one, the way that he describes it. This idea of diversifying our trading partners and then getting to work at home on affordability, things like the middle class tax cut, and home building. And these are themes that we heard in the campaign, but I see some of those themes really solidifying for him. And whether or not you like the CEO analogy, I think the way that he's delivering will be welcome. It's a refreshing change. He has a point of view, he has a direction, and you really get the sense, while we may not know all of the details of the plan, my takeaway is he's going to get stuff done.
Well, he's going to try, Jordan. There's a lot of things that can stop it, but right now he certainly has political capital and some political momentum. What are your thoughts on what you heard from the Prime Minister there?
Well, he certainly brings the energy of a shareholder pitch meeting to the task, and I do think energy is part of it, right? Signaling that change, that engagement, that is a real shift from what we saw under the Trudeau government. So, look, I mean, this is a very ambitious agenda. Tim's absolutely right. They're not doing anything to tamp down the scope of these expectations. And I think part of it is the hope that some of that energy can carry them forward. Now, I will say, I think I was struck in his remarks, there's a lot of stuff in here that is achievable in a short time period. So things like the interprovincial trade barriers, already there's really good progress on that. That seems likely to meet its target. Reaching out and working with the Europeans on defense, this makes a lot of sense. There's ready pathways for that. But when I look at some of the things in here and in the throne speech today that actually touch on Canadians' lives, lives, you're coming up with sort of not a whole lot. Like really, it's the income tax cut, which is $800, a little bit more than $800 a couple, and it's taking the taxes off some home purchases. But like I got to tell you, for the half of Canadians who are living paycheck to paycheck, they're not one tax cut away from changing that. So the problems that underlie the lack of popularity that we saw for Justin Trudeau in the dying days of his government are still there. And I question whether they're going to be immediately touched by this agenda.
A question, though, on that. Do you think the issue with sort of the unpopularity of the Trudeau government at the end was that those issues were there, or they didn't seem to be a priority?
Yeah, I think it's both.
Do you know what I mean?
I think it's both. And I think that there's certainly a risk here for Prime Minister Carney as well. One of the things that the Trudeau government, over time, it became increasingly disconnected from those struggles that Canadians were facing on affordability and things like the housing crisis. And I think that with Prime Minister Carney, you have somebody walking into that role who, yes, brings incredible strengths in terms of international networks and competence on financial and fiscal matters, but who also does bring a sense that this is not a guy who knows what the prices are at a grocery store. So for today, that's not a problem, but as we go down this path, that could become an issue for them.
All right. Okay, look, one thing I want to play is a segment from that, and this is when I asked him about what's going to happen in Saskatoon next week, because he is meeting with the premiers. The first ministers are going to meet for a couple of days. Scott Moe is going to play host, and it's about the issue of these projects of national significance. And Wab Kinew was here yesterday and suggested we're going to get news out of this next week, that we're going to get specific projects. I asked the Prime Minister, about that. Here's what Mark Carney had to say.
We need to move on these nation-building projects. So projects that bring Canada together, projects that diversify our economy, projects that help us export to new markets and really move this economy forward. So yes, the ask of provinces, the ask of the private sector is, which projects do you have that reach those criteria? What we're going to do is fast-track the approval, truly fast-track the approval of those projects. And we are going to name specific projects to which these fast-track approvals apply, so that the country can get moving.
So, Tim, it's interesting. It's not just talking about moving fast. It's very quickly, like within a week, we're going to get names of specific projects coming out of Saskatoon that this is what we're going to fast track, at least in the first wave of these projects.
Hallelujah, if he can pull it off. I mean, what I usually found fascinating in the throne speech that the King read, I think he said project reviews down from 5 years to 2 years. That will be a world record-like pace. Let's see it, because there is lots of development there. But I go back to something else he said to you. You can't escape, nor should you, your duty to consult with Indigenous peoples.
Of course, yeah.
So the premiers may be here. The federal government may be there. In the areas where Indigenous consultation is important, are Indigenous partners and others there? And maybe they are. But again, I think he is trying to use the turbo. He keeps calling this a crisis, and it's a really smart thing to do, because as Amanda will tell you, any of us who have worked in crisis communication, there's a greater imperative to move. So as long as people believe that they are still in a very difficult period and quick decisions must be made, they will throw away perhaps other considerations. I'm not saying that's disingenuous by the Prime Minister, and I think we probably are, as long as Donald Trump there is in some kind of crisis, but can he continue to funnel that, and for how long?
But just on that, there is what Mark Carney is saying of getting alignment on review processes and on timelines, is still making sure you do the environmental considerations and the Indigenous consultation processes. And then it's what is in Bill 5 in Ontario, where a cabinet can declare things essentially commercial zones where you don't have to meet regulations, you don't have to meet laws. David Eby in British Columbia with Bill 15 doing a similar sort of thing, not quite to the same extent of Doug Ford. I know they want to move fast, but there's a risk here. If you move too fast, you start trampling on the things that the throne speech says you need to protect.
Yeah, but it seems like it's a risk they're prepared to take. And right now, I mean, this is, I don't know what the critique has been of these things in the throne speech yet. I've not seen or heard them. But usually if there is going to be a critique, it comes rapidly, it comes quickly. I'm not hearing it. So he may sense he has a broad public audience that's prepared to give them some space and then course correct after the fact. Yes, it comes with risk, but that seems to be what it is.
And it's also the possibility his premiers at the provincial level are
we'll
moving faster than maybe he's comfortable. So I have to see on that. But, Sherelle, this is a big part of, the Carney promise. quick decisions, quick action, quick moves. So, depending on what comes out of these meetings next week, we know the Western premiers talked about, an economic corridor getting to the port of Churchill. Wab Kinew has talked about this, as a big priority for him because it also opens up things to the north, gets resources to Tidewater. It sounds like there's the potential for actual real news from a summer meeting between the Prime Minister and the premiers.
Potentially, which would be interesting. But there's something I do keep coming back to, which is a word that he used, the Prime Minister used, and I can't immediately recall if it was in direct correlation to these specific nation-building projects or if it was later on when he was talking more about energy. But he used the word competition, and he said that there's essentially going to be a competition for these projects, and that kind of sets up a really interesting dynamic because now you essentially have people fighting over what is going to be, which of their projects is going to be.
You're picking winners and losers, right?
You're picking winners and losers. Who is going to be the most nation building of the nation? Who is going to be, the putting forward something that is supposed to be seen as more important? So as that comes together, and I do think that's where we will start to see, everybody will be talking unity, and everybody will be thinking, okay, yes, we want to move forward. We want to move forward quickly. However, there's always going to be that thing in the back of everybody's minds going, oh, but what about me? And why aren't you prioritizing my project?
Right, and Amanda, that leads you to potential regional tensions, obviously, and intra-provincial tensions, but it strikes me that the competition that the Prime Minister is talking about there is between the private sector proponents of the specific projects to try to get them to do what they can to get into the fast-track process. And he also pushed back that unless it's like a massive nation-changing project, don't expect big bags of federal cash to go into it, which I also found was interesting.
Yeah, he was pretty direct on that point. And listen, I think a couple of things. I think that agree with Tim. He's using the circumstances of our times. He's using the crisis as a catalyst to be able to push some of this forward. He's also using this kind of unity building, country building dialogue, the kind of rhetoric that is about, let's pull together this critical time. We're going to diversify our trading relationships. We're going to look internally, domestically at all of the riches that we have in this country and how we're going to utilize them to the greatest extent. But then he's also addressing one of the biggest criticism, not just of this government, but of any government, and that's the slow pace to get projects to market, right? Any kind of project. And so he's saying, I'm going to move it from five years to 2 years. We're going to set up a major federal office. He didn't say 2 weeks or 2 minutes. It's still 2 years, and says that we're going to be able to do that by addressing some of the long-standing things that we've all talked about as not getting in the way, but presenting unique challenges like environmental considerations, obviously constitutional obligations, Indigenous peoples' issues surrounding some of these projects. So saying these are the things that if we're going to move these projects along and we're going to do it quickly, we're still going to do it in the confines of our reality. But I'm going to have the buy-in of the provinces to get it done, and I'm going to bring the private sector along for the ride.
But Jordan, the calibration on this is going to be really important, right? Because industry will complain that the pendulum swung too far one way under Justin Trudeau. You look at Bill 5, you look at Bill in Ontario, Bill 15 in BC, you can see the pendulum swinging too far the other way, and then environmental considerations and certainly Indigenous considerations, people get anxious, right? So it's finding that Goldilocks spot on this, right?
Yeah, and I think that there's a sense, sometimes you hear this talked about that all that's missing is political will to speed up this process, and that's just not the case. There are real political and material and environmental and rights trade-offs around a lot of these projects, and that's why they are difficult to get approved. And so that doesn't disappear just because we now have a little bit more national consensus about moving things forward. So that's going to all be compressed into this process. But I do think that, one element of what he's doing here that's smart is that, the federal government doesn't appear like it's going to be picking winners and losers. They're really leaving that to the provinces to do.
Yeah.
And so each premier has their own set of political incentives to expedite development in their own provinces in specific ways. And so what Carney is talking about there is partnering with provinces for projects that are already going to be sort of successful within that own province's framework. And then working to bring those forward more quickly. And so I think in a certain sense, that's a way that's a little bit smart to get around some of that notion that the federal government is picking winners and losers among the provinces. Now, the question is, of course, what are premiers like Danielle Smith going to say about this?
Right.
Are they going to take yes for an answer on this? Or are they going to continue to insist that this is not a sufficient pullback from the federal government on that?
Right, and on the picking winners and losers comment, just to clarify, I think the First Minister's table will be picking the winners and losers. Like, I don't think it's Mark Carney dictating it, though. I do think it's going to be a harder sell. For example, Doug Ford's tunnel under Toronto, which he thinks is a national project. I think it's going to be hard to get buy-in for everybody on that. You know what I mean? But on that, the trade-offs. This is going to be the question in terms of rushing things to a point, right? This is what they need to watch for here, because that's where the backlash can come in, especially with the progressive side of a Liberal voting coalition.
Of course, and not even just a backlash among voters. There are very real consequences to not getting these processes right. Indigenous communities have legal rights in terms of free, prior, and informed consent. And if those rights are not respected in the course of these consultations and these reviews, then they will have recourse to the courts to slow and even stop projects. And we've certainly seen that in the past in Canada, and I would expect that we will see that again if these processes are not meeting those benchmarks. So there is possibly a sweet spot to be found here, but the reason that this hasn't been done in the past is because it is very difficult to do.
Right, and look, on that, there's been no more difficult big project to get done than a pipeline, and pipelines have, for economic reasons, for political reasons, for environmental reasons, it has fueled frustration and some Western alienation. And I talked to Mark Carney about pipelines and Alberta separatism, and here's what he said about that.
It's remarkable, in some circles, this conversation starts and ends with pipelines.
But that is what it's become politically, right?
No, it's not. No, that is not what it's become politically. That is not what it's become for Canada. Canada as a nation. Canadians want, yes, they want energy pipelines that make sense. They also want grid connections between our clean grids. They want actually less carbon. So they want carbon capture and storage pathways project to move forward.
Tim, what do you make of that? A pipeline is a probability, a possibility under Carney, but not a necessity. Alberta would argue it's a necessity. Certainly that's what Danielle Smith has put on the table. How do you view his answers on that issue?
I think he's being as evasive as he probably needs to be at the moment. He's not gone all Stephen Guilbeault, nor do I expect him to do so. I think he is looking for others to do the work there. Look, we've had what Quebec recently suggests that, maybe these things aren't so bad. I think he's trying to play and get a feel for where others are going there. Pipelines, yes, to your question, have become a symbol. You only need to look at Keystone XL. I mean, that was Biden's first big move to shut that down and the opportunity that it provided. But I also get in his comments, David, and in the comments of his energy minister in Calgary last week, that they are
That's at least a big change.
Yeah. Well, and as you always say, until they prove us wrong, let's look at what they've said so far. Hodgson, first speech, says, it's about delivery. It's about getting things done. Carney has not backed away from that. He has not put 14,000, he's been a bit evasive, but he's not put a million caveats on it all. And in other places, he said he's not opposed to a pipeline. So we should expect, as he is calibrating and looking at options, that a pipeline of some variety or two could be in the mix.
Well, sorry, you want to jump in there?
Well, I was going to say, and we'll see, right? Because right now this is also a hypothetical. There's no project
proposal.
proponent. There's nothing on the table. So it's a lot easier to be enthusiastic about a notional project than it is about a real one that has more intense political trade-offs. And I would also say that it's not even so clear necessarily that approving a pipeline is sufficient to get a check mark on that in the minds of voters in resource-intense regions. Just look at the Trudeau government. They purchased a pipeline in order to facilitate it as an economic project and are still given credit for blocking that type of development. So it's not so clear that in practice this actually works out quite that way.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to make sure. There is no proponent right now. There's no project to greenlight, but there's certainly not I don't sense a hostility towards the idea. It's a question of where it goes. But, the expectation, the political expectation, certainly that Premier Danielle Smith lays out, it's like she wants access to the north, access to the east. Now, maybe the Churchill Port option that, that has been floated satisfies that. David Eby doesn't seem to like the Prince Rupert idea, even though it's not quite where Northern Gateway was going to go. But what do you make of the political risk there and the needle the Prime Minister is threading?
Well, it is a needle that he has to thread carefully because, look, he has to be the Prime Minister for the entire country, not just for Alberta or any other oil-producing or energy-producing, conventional energy-producing region. He talked about, it's not. He tried to say that, this isn't necessarily what the question is, because this isn't all that Canadians want. And I do think he's right on that. Not everybody is clamoring for a pipeline. Not everybody is clamoring for more oil sands development. And he has to walk that line because, like I said, he's the Prime Minister for the whole country, not just for Alberta.
Right. But Amanda, there is a stated desire for a boost in productivity. And, it's crude, but crude boosts productivity if you can do that. And there is, it creates jobs, it creates wealth, it creates revenue. Look, I'm not here for my looks. But, it is also, the absence of it does create this frustration in Alberta that needs to be addressed in some way. So what do you think of the approach they're having? Because Tim Hodgson did lay out a pretty open view of the fossil fuel sector that we maybe didn't, that we haven't really seen in 10 years from the Liberals.
Yeah, so I think a few things. I think obviously in the throne speech, the words, "we will become the leading energy superpower," part of that speech, he talked directly in reference to pipelines and projects. In your interview, he said more can, should, and will be done. So I think both the way that he communicates about pipelines, as well as Canadians' appetite to have a discussion in a different way, has changed. I think that this is a significant difference from what we saw from the Trudeau government. And I think even the willingness to be open to these conversations, because the world has changed and because Canadians understand that we have to get our resources to other markets, allows him to be able to be potentially, I think, a little more broad in his language. But at the same time, this is an area where he is actually setting some expectations. He pushed back quite a bit. These aren't the only projects, he says, right? And he talks about the grids, and he talks about carbon, and he talks about other projects in the north. And if this government is able to start laying some framework to have a broader conversation about some of these projects, I think that's really interesting territory for him, because pipeline has become sort of the catchphrase that takes it all in, as opposed to the number of things that could be done across the country, which really we're not talking about the same degree.
Can I just add something? Because I think that there's something we're right on top of that's really important. There's a real brand remake happening here on two levels, right? Whereas Justin Trudeau, fairly or unfairly, was accused of making Canada too woke and closed and focused on very niche things related to the Prime Minister. Mark Carney is now saying, hey, Globe, which you know me, I'm a global player. We're open for business. That's why he's not saying no to anything. He's also very deliberately stepping forcefully away from everything that was the previous Trudeau government. He's borrowing Harper government branding, energy superpower, new government, and that in and of itself is a degree of audaciousness that he may end up getting inflamed by it all in the end. But this is a big brand remake, and he's trying to show himself as, you may have trouble with the guy a little further south, but the guy up north, he wants to do deals. He wants your money. He wants to play. And that's the world Carney knows. That's why people, I think he thinks, elected him.
But, Jordan, I wonder, I agree, right? He wants to say, we are a port of calm and stability with abundant natural resources, and we're going to train up our workforce. Your money is safe here. Look at the deals we're going to have with Europe and with Asia. But the pipeline thing with, open to it, but not emphatically endorsing it necessarily. I think it comes back to a point your podcast partner, Corey Tonight, made, that what Danielle Smith is advocating for are projects that go through 4 provinces. And once, on her terms, let's just do it. And you just can't do that as a prime minister in a country structured like this one.
Well, that's right. And that's not the only problem there. If you look at what is one of the biggest factors creating investment uncertainty in the oil sands right now. Yes, it's Trump and tariffs, but it's also Danielle Smith and separatism, right? Like you have an environment that's becoming very difficult for investment, in part because there's political instability around some of those questions. So I think that there is a big gap still between what we're hearing from Prime Minister Carney and what you're hearing from Premier Smith. And I expect that we're going to see more fireworks around that coming out of the First Minister's meeting next week.
Right, maybe that's why it's in Saskatoon. They're going to bridge the divide
Right.
right next door. Look, as they pivot away from the United States, they're looking at deeper integration with the European Union, in particular on defense. The Prime Minister is suggesting that, look, he's off to a couple of summits, NATO, European Union summit, and they want to have some sort of an agreement in place by Canada Day, another Canada Day deal. Have a listen to this.
We're spending over 75 cents on every dollar of capital spend for defense goes to the United States.
Right.
That's not smart. What's better if we spend more at home, if we have diversified partnerships? Look, part of what's been happening in the last few months since I became Prime Minister is a number of conversations of increasing specificity with our major European partners so that we become defense partners with them. That we become part of a very big build-out of their defense industrial base, which will have big benefits for jobs here in Canada. We're making great progress on that, and by Canada Day, we'd like to see something concrete there.
Okay, so that's defense policy, industrial policy, trade policy, and foreign policy all bundled into one, and I have to show you why this is happening. This is the latest from the President on Truth Social. I told Canada, which very much wants to be part of our fabulous Golden Dome system, capital D, GDNS, that it will cost $61 billion if they remain a separate but unequal nation, but will cost $0 if they become our cherished 51st state. They are considering the offer. Yeah, okay. I don't know if that's a response to the throne speech or what, but here we are. Setting aside, Sherelle, what the President is saying, I'm not going to ask you to do that. But what the Prime Minister is saying is, he sounds like they're in the pretty advanced stages of inking at least a framework agreement with Europe to start selling things back and forth, reduce the reliance on the United States, and build up capacity on both sides of the Atlantic to start, I guess, making weapons and building ammunition together, because with the U.S. going the way the U.S. is going, you just kind of can't rely on that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's what everybody who is, at the grocery store and looking at the prices and looking at their bank accounts, they're going, God, if only we could make more weapons in Canada, everything would be just dandy.
Well, I think they would like a better supplied CAF, maybe, the ability to give Ukraine things other than loans. I don't know. Like, I think there's an appetite for some of that out there beyond, basic affordability challenges.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think for a segment of the population, absolutely, there's a big appetite for it. I don't know if the appetite is massive amongst, the average Canadian citizen, like I said, who's looking to, figure out their day-to-day. Mark Carney said something interesting. He said he's not a fan of picking an arbitrary number and then trying to figure out how to spend up to it. Yeah. But he's kind of doing exactly that. We have the NATO commitments. He said we're going to hit that by a certain, point in time, and he's still trying to figure out how we're going to fulfill that commitment, and this is part of that. Yes, we have, as a country, we have a commitment we've made a commitment. NATO as a whole is going to be asking for more, and Canada as a member is going to be trying to figure out how are we going to fulfill that? How are we going to look like we are pulling our weight? And as everybody's moving away from the United States, and that is part of it, wanting to be sovereign, wanting to diversify where our money is going, that is still going to be part of the prospect of how are we going to manage to spend that money. Because the defense budget has always been the defense budget. It's been a matter of we cannot seem to spend the defense budget that we have, and that is what's going to have to change.
Yes, and Amanda, what I don't know if I've reversed engineered it from the Prime Minister's answer. I think he has done the assessment of the national security requirements and the basic requirements of the Canadian Armed Forces, and that goes past the 2%. So I think that's an easy target for him to commit to. It's going 3.5% or even 5%, as Secretary General Ruda was talking about, that I think is more problematic there. But it seems like the disentangling it from the reliance on the U.S. and of sending 75 cents of every dollar you spend on munitions and stuff to America, that becomes a value proposition to Canadians and Canadian industry to buy into this, right?
Yeah, and this is the pitch that he made to Canadians, this idea that we've been over reliant on the US, both economically and from a security standpoint. So he said really clearly, we're going to spend more. We're going to spend more at home. We're going to strengthen the Arctic. We're going to, he said, we're going to spend more sooner, and we're going to spend more with our European partners. So it was pretty, I mean, he was clear. He wasn't going to commit to a new NATO target per se, but I think he was certainly clear on both the direction, and I think also kind of the appetite that he feels that Canadians have to do this at this time. He also linked it, which I thought was really interesting, to needing a fall budget, right? He said, and that is why we will have a fall budget, because we're not going to make these determinations next week or in the coming weeks.
Right.
These are things that we're going to have to spend more on, and we're going to need more time to do.
Well, it sounds like, Jordan, he's going to go to these summits, right? And that will give him greater costing certainty. So then they figure out where that goes into a fiscal plan. Whereas if you did do a budget this month, which I think a lot of us, well, not this month, but June, you'd have to tear it up in September, or your fall economic statement would be essentially a supercharged defense mini budget, it seems.
Yeah, well, and look, I mean, I think they're obviously going into the NATO summit with a good sense of what they'd like to spend and how quickly they'd like to get there. But there is a real challenge coming for this government in terms of these budget commitments, because on the one hand, you have Prime Minister Carney talking about fiscal restraint, talking about cuts to planned spending, talking about getting it down 2%, which over time could be an effective cut. And at the same time, even for Canada to start to get to that 2%, you're talking like that, billions and billions, up, $14 billion of new spending to get us there, let alone going beyond that if we get to the 5% target that is likely going to be agreed upon at the NATO summit. So there is a bit of a collision course on the numbers there, and I can see wanting to push that conversation off a few months. But look, I mean, I think to the question of involving Canada in NATO rearmament in Europe, this is a smart thing for Canada to be doing. Defense integration with the United States is so significant here in Canada. It will be one of the very last spheres that is able to be separated. And so leadership sort of from the top to indicate that we're going a different direction, I think is really important. But there's a tension here with what we were hearing out last week about Canada potentially being in these discussions around Golden Dome. So, at a moment where NATO itself is in crisis because of what the United States is doing, where increasingly, we have a land war in Europe, and we're seeing that matters there are now sort of an ally, matters are for European allies without the U.S. Where is Canada going to be on that? Yeah. And I think it's smart for us to be making investments there.
But Tim, there's this tension, right, on defense, industrial policy, how you buy things, procurement and building things, and then the need for continental security with the United States. Because even if you move away politically, you can't move away physically, right? So Golden Dome may be nuts to some people, but there's going to need to be some sort of continental cooperation on these things.
Well, and also, as people in the military will tell you, our adversaries aren't targeting the difference between Calgary and Connecticut. We're one big landmass, and we're a target of opportunity. But I think first on the Golden Dome, I think Carney's actually played this pretty well, I think, because look, if we look at history, going back to Reagan, whenever any of these big, audacious, crazy space-based defense things come up, they all fall apart eventually. And Donald Trump may be the great deal maker, and you are, Mr. President, that 3 years, this thing is probably not going to happen. So what does it hurt Carney to say he's part of the discussions? I think if Pierre Poilievre was Prime Minister, he would probably say the same thing. Go in there, be part of whatever these discussions are, and let the domestic politics of the United States sort it out as it always has. On continental security, we are always going to be part of that. We're part of NORAD, where we have been and will continue to be. I think the play that Carney and Macron and Starmer and others are looking at is like they're going to call Trump's bluff on Europe and say, all right, Mr. President, you don't want to do any work in Europe anymore for now. All right, we'll take that on. And how will you calculate that as it relates to your your arbitrary number of 2% or 5%. And it'll be interesting to see how that discussion plays out at NATO. That arguably is something Canada with its other European-based NATO allies and other European-friendly powers could do on a short-term basis. Because this is all about timelines, right? This is a risk management exercise over 3 to 4 years, too. There are real reinvestments we have to do in the CAF, and then there are the Trump management exercises of the next 3 years.
Okay, look, I want to move on to the very historic moment we saw today for Canada at this critical time. King Charles delivered the speech from the throne today, outlining the new government's priorities, reaffirming the country's sovereignty, and officially opening the 45th session of Parliament.
I've always had the greatest admiration for Canada's unique identity. On Juno Beach, at Dieppe, on the Somme, at Beaumont-Hamel, at Ypres, and on Vimy Ridge, Canadians fought and died alongside our closest allies. Today, Canada faces another critical moment. Democracy, pluralism, the rule of law, self-determination, and freedom are values which Canadians hold dear, and ones which the government is determined to protect. A confident Canada can seize this opportunity by recognizing that all Canadians can give themselves far more than any foreign power on any continent can ever take away. As the anthem reminds us, the true North is indeed strong and free.
Well, much of the throne speech, of course, was written by the federal government, laying out its plans for the return to Parliament, and it was criticized by other federal leaders, saying it doesn't meet the mark. All right.
The phrase that came to my mind is that this is not a worker-centered throne speech. I guess another way to put it is it also struck me as a bit of a conservative light throne speech.
We did see a lot of the right slogans and political talking points, but no clear plans to get it done.
We will try, I will try to find common grounds in order to work together.
Okay, that's the next thing we're going to discuss here at the Power Panel. Sherelle, the sustained applause at the end for, as the anthem says, the true North is indeed strong and free. Very subtle line, whoever wrote that, for the King to say it. I just wonder, Canadians kind of rallied around the flag in response to Trump. I don't know if they rallied around the crown or the monarch, but still, it was an interesting moment to have, King Charles open up Parliament with that speech. What do you make of what we saw today?
Yeah, I mean, did it do its job? I think it did. If the idea behind it, aside from the actual procedural pomp and circumstances, to send that message to the U.S. president, yeah, I think that worked. I know that the U.S. ambassador, Hoekstra, he's said that, there's better ways to send that message, but I don't know if that's true, because to this specific audience, somebody who loves nothing more than, a big show, this is about as, for Canada anyways, this is about as big as it gets. And to have the King come over and be seen on camera with, Donald Trump's Canadian adversaries, if you want to call us that, being very chummy, glad-handing, getting the kind of welcome and having the sort of rapport that he can only aspire to. He has to be invited to go to the UK to have a state visit and get all that pomp and circumstance. And you have King Charles coming to us, and he is coming here and is in our backyard. So that is, I think, absolutely going to be having the right effect that they wanted it to have.
Amanda, I never know how effective these things are as a communications exercise, right? Because there's all this subtlety, like, he wore this medal and he had this particular ribbon. Look at that maple leaf brooch the Queen is wearing. Like, I don't know if that level of subtlety works with the American president in the year of our Lord 2025, but it met the standard of the Hippocratic Oath. This did no harm, and it may have potentially done some good.
Oh, no, I think it did a lot of good. Maybe some of the subtleties I don't know that everyone picked it up, but we're talking about it. I think that the reason why this worked is because it reinforced a lot of the themes that the Carney government wants Canadians to talk about and care about: Canadian identity, sovereignty, unity. And it was laid out by a prominent and respected, we'll call it third party, right? A global voice that is going to attract global headlines. This is about as good as it gets in terms of thinking through, how do we deliver this message in a new way? Remember, the monarchy hasn't been part of delivering a throne speech since the 70s. So even just the novelty of this happening in Canada, made it so that everyone was paying attention. I don't know that everyone's paying attention to our throne speech otherwise, but again, reinforced some of these themes. And I'll just take one moment to share. I think one of the most powerful aspects of this was certainly the line that was quoted at the end: true north, strong and free. But it was something else. It was this idea that Canadians are feeling anxious, they're feeling worried.
Right.
The globe, there's this unsettled feeling, and yet this presents a new opportunity to think big and act bigger. And I thought that part of the speech, this idea that there's new relationships to be forged, new allies and trading partners to work with, there's opportunity and hope and optimism. And I thought that some of that came through outside of the domestic stuff that they got into was really critical and will land well with Canadians.
So Jordan, I mean, certainly Canadians probably watch this in significant numbers, right? Live coverage on the networks and online. I don't know if it penetrated into the United States, right? I don't know. But certainly in the UK, when you're trying to do things with the government there, having the monarch, with the new Prime Minister being the former Bank of England governor during the time of Brexit, there's going to be, it's going to hit some of the notes in the United Kingdom. I don't know. What do you think of this today?
Sure, I think it's just as much of a flex about Carney's relationships in the UK as it is about anything else. And that's fine enough as a communication strategy. I think to Amanda's point, it's true that more Canadians likely tuned in and paid some attention to the throne speech than they might have otherwise if the king wasn't there. As to whether it's effective with Trump, we'll all watch Truth Social to know. But
well, the Golden Dome tweet, whatever you call those things out.
Sure. I mean, and look, and there's real limitations, I think, in terms of the King's ability to actually deliver a tough message about Canada's sovereignty. He can't be political, and so it is very subtle. And so, I too would question.
He can't be partisan, but sovereignty isn't political.
Sure.
When you're the sovereign.
Sure, but yet, he can't speak directly to the issue at hand, is what I mean. And and I think rightly, Buckingham Palace came under some criticism for extending the hand to Trump not once but twice for a state visit. And so there's maybe a bit of repair happening here in that. But, when I look at the throne speech more broadly, and, and I appreciate Amanda's enthusiasm and optimism, but I was so struck, like today, to hear that idea that this crisis with the U.S. and this crisis of the tariff war with the United States is a great opportunity for prosperity here in Canada. Look, like we just heard today that 8,000 people are being laid off at the Bay, okay? Yeah. We have the highest unemployment rate that we've seen in the last 8 years outside of COVID last month. We have only about 40% of unemployed Canadians who can access EI. And there was not a word about any of that in the throne speech. So Canadians are worried, but they're worried in a very concrete, a very real sense in their own lives. And I think that the aspirational stuff that was put forward in here is all well and good for building on that communications momentum that this government is so wedded to right now. But it really does not touch the true crisis that a lot of Canadians are feeling right now.
Right. Jordan's not wrong about that. And the data is very compelling, but I think in the hierarchy of needs to Hall and Maslow here, Trump is still at the top of that pyramid. And so
he's the cause of a lot of these things, not the Bay specifically, but the other things.
All of this. I would just go back to what Trump said of Carney, or was reported to have said of Carney. Well, he likes the way he dressed. He likes the way he is. He seems like a good gentleman. So what have you seen today? If this was about Trump and getting him to buy in more, well, and to use Trump parlance, which isn't very erudite, it's this guy Carney. He's got juice. You know, he can haul over the King of England and get him here and have him do this. Oh, well, I like the King of England. He was thrilled when Keir Starmer said you can have a state visit. As simplistic as that may sound, as moronic as that may sound, that's the sort of stuff that it appears this president cares about. Who do you know? Can you get the right audiences? Are we going to be in the same places? It builds for him a level of credibility that the last prime minister wasn't able to achieve. Now, Mark Carney's challenge is to be able to maintain that in a positive way with a very, to be polite, erratic leader who could change his perspective on a dime.
Right. Okay, so Sherelle, just as the last word to you, I mean, the thrones, look, Mark Carney has been prime minister for 75 days. He was sworn in on the 14th of March. He won the leadership on the 9th of March. And just think, like, it's moving. There's a lot of things that have been happening. He's going to have his first question period tomorrow. He's already had a trip to the Oval Office, to the UK and to Paris. His first question period tomorrow. Like, now that he's got his cabinet, won his election, laid out his throne speech, we get to see him in Parliament. It's not Pierre Poilievre, it's going to be Andrew Scheer leading off. I mean, what are you going to be watching for tomorrow when Mark Carney takes his first question, assuming he goes?
Well, assuming, yeah. Maybe he'll want to sleep in a little.
Yeah.
I mean, it's late
I don't know
in the
if he
day,
sleeps in. No, at 5 a.m. may be late for him. I don't know. Yeah.
Takes a 2 p.m. nap. I don't know. How is he going to handle being questioned? That is something that we keep seeing, and he doesn't seem to love it. He doesn't seem to love being needled and having that pushback, and that is all that question period is going to be. And coming from going up against Andrew Scheer, that is, I mean, you have Pierre Poilievre, and you have, and Andrew Scheer comes, right underneath that in terms of being able to needle at somebody. So I think that'll be a really interesting vantage point of seeing how is he going to move going forward, because we haven't really seen him. We've seen him wander through politics, but we haven't seen him be a truly political animal, and that's kind of where some of these things are going to have to come to light.
Yeah, the pomp of today will give way to the pugilism of tomorrow, and we'll see, how he handles all of that. Well, in the throne speech delivered by King Charles today, there were promises to build major projects and to go fast. But Conservatives, well, they remain skeptical.
We did see a lot of the right slogans and political talking points, but no clear plans to get it done. So we're going to put forward what we consider to be a constructive amendment that will add very specific plans. So for example, the government says they want to get projects built. Great. We've got just the plan to do it. Repeal C-69, the anti-development law. Repeal the energy cap, the offshore shipping ban, the electric vehicle mandate.
For more Conservative reaction to what was outlined today, I'm joined now by Ontario Conservative MP Adam Chambers. Adam Chambers, good to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here, David.
Your leader says there is no plan, but in the interview I did with Mark Carney earlier, he strongly suggested, or flat out said, there's going to be some projects announced next week for fast tracking when they meet with the premiers in Saskatoon. Is that a plan?
Well, David, I would say, on a good day for the country in terms of having the sovereign here, I think was, nice pageantry. But when we get down to brass tacks, if you look at the throne speech, as Pierre said, our leader, that it had a lot of slogans or say the right words, the right intentions. But when you see, okay, well, where's the meat? There are only 2 or 3 very specific instances that require legislation. GST off of homes is an example. Fixing the border will require legislation, as well as dealing with crime. So, okay, well, where's that legislation? I mean, the government promised that they were going to do something on the border in December, so they've had a long time to develop the legislation. Conservatives said, look, we want to take the GST off of homes. The government campaigned, Prime Minister Carney campaigned on taking the GST off of homes. Well, why don't we sit a few extra weeks in Parliament and pass the bill to take the GST off of homes so that we can deliver that relief to Canadians right away? But we're left with, a throne speech, and the only piece of legislation, if you want to call it legislation, is a Ways and Means motion to reduce personal income taxes, which isn't a bad thing, but it's only one thing in the 3 weeks before they want to shut down Parliament for the summer.
Well, I mean, there could be more, presumably. There could be more things added to the order paper. I don't know, right? We'll have to see what Stephen McKinnon does. But The criticism of a throne speech, it is only ever the broad strokes and outlines, and there is some more specifics in there, though it's kind of lifted from the platform or the mandate letter, and I know Conservatives say it's also lifted from your ideas. But the level of specificity that is suddenly being demanded from a throne speech is not how I've ever seen throne speeches done in my 52 years.
Well, David, I think it would be fair if the government says it's not doing a budget, that the throne speech would then be a little bit more specific, or at least say, and we're following up with legislation immediately to be introduced on these 3 or 4 very important measures. I mean, these are the Prime Minister Carney's own words when his interview with you says, we're in a crisis. Well, it doesn't really sound like we're in a crisis if the only piece of legislation we're getting before the end of the summer is one small personal income tax cut for Canadians. Again, good idea, but we've outlined a number of things we'd be willing to work on with the government and even extend Parliament into sitting to the summer to get done. Who's going to buy a new home over the summer if the GST cut off of new homes isn't going to be tabled until the fall?
What makes you think that's going to wait until the fall? Because it seems to me I know the income tax is the #1 thing, and I think symbolically they wanted to put that there because it hits everybody. But you've got to do supply. They want to do the federal free trade legislation in terms of removing interprovincial trade barriers, and it seems to me they want to do the GST cut quickly. I mean, it seems to me if they introduce that tomorrow, Thursday, you can get that done before Parliament rises, can you not?
Well, David, I mean, I have not heard from the House Leader on the Liberal side or on the government side that they're planning on introducing that kind of legislation. In fact, it seems like what they're planning to introduce is the personal income tax cut. We've said there are a number of items we'd be willing to work with the government on. I don't see how, if they were planning to bring in the GST cut for homes, I think they would have announced that certainly before now. We would like to see it. But again, I think it will create a bit of a challenge in the housing market if you go the entire summer without introducing legislation to do that, because again, who would purchase a home if they think they're going to get the GST cut in a few months from now? So I think that'll actually play with a negative impact on the market over the summer months.
Okay. You, in the shadow cabinet, you're the trade critic, if I remember correctly. One of the issues the Prime Minister sort of talked about today after the throne speech, well, he referenced it in the throne speech, gave some more specifics of it in our conversation. It's about having some sort of an arrangement with Europe in June on a defense partnership, on the Rearm Europe initiative, but to build defense capacity here and start doing more of a industrial and defense procurement policy swap with Europe and moving away from the reliance on the United States. How do you view that conceptually? I know there's a lot of fine print to see there, but moving away from the 75 cents on the dollar, going to the U.S. on defense.
Well, I would say, look, again, as you mentioned, a lot of fine print to see there. I think they're at the very, very early stages. I would consider myself to be an all of the above conservative. I think we have to think about, most parties campaigned on reducing reliance on America. What does that look like? So again, interested to see how those discussions unfold. I mean, the Prime Minister's also mentioned about joining the Ballistic Missile Defense Program with the U.S. So I mean, we'll have to see how these things come to fruition or not. But we'll see how those discussions go before anybody says whether they're great or they need more scrutiny.
Right. The president is saying on Truth Social that we can join Golden Dome for free if we become a state. But I'm not going to ask you to weigh in on that because who knows what that actually means. But the implication, though, that something is coming. Wab Kinew sat there yesterday and said next week in Saskatoon they're expecting movement on the fast tracking of projects. The Prime Minister said as much today. What are you looking to see there? I know the Western premiers have talked about an economic corridor to the Port of Churchill that would maybe open things up for energy and other exports in that direction and do some northern development. I know Premier Ford has talked about the Ring of Fire and the tunnel under the GTA, which I don't know if you support or not as a Simcoe guy. But what do you hope to see come out of the First Minister's meeting next week on this stuff?
Well, I hope to see exactly what people spoke to me about during the election. I think they want to see collaboration. I would say I was impressed with some of the rhetoric or the communication from premiers. In particular, Premier Kinew said, look, this is an opportunity for a nation-building project. Okay, that's great. Let's see what that looks like. I think all Canadians don't really care about the level of government, which is supposed to be tasked with, fixing what or getting together, but let's figure out.
Get it done.
Yeah, let's get it done. So, bringing it back to the federal level, we're here, we're ready to work. I think we're ready to work on some things, collaboratively where it makes sense, hold the government accountable, where we have some concerns. We're going to vote on main estimates were tabled. The government's asking for $500 billion of spending authorities without any committees to go through that spending, without any budget to say, hey, this is how this is going to play out over the next few years. I'm not really sure that's the right kind of foot to get off on federally, at least. I think, for Prime Minister Carney to ask for that kind of money to spend, I think we should have committees up and running. We should have an ability to scrutinize some of that spending. If we're not going to get a budget until a few months from now, or, wherever that is, the fall goes all the way to December, David.
I feel like it's got to be by October at the latest, don't you think?
Well,
you know what I mean? Like at the very latest, that's what it is.
I want to, the Prime Minister is setting himself some very, very high expectations. Very, very high in ambition. Will he have the perspiration to carry it through? I would say, but only having one or maybe two pieces of legislation before we go for the summer, when you have at least one party saying, look, like we're here, we're willing to work with you to pass some of these things, like the GST cut on homes. I think, the proof is in the pudding. I had a grade 5 teacher who said, I'm from the Missouri state, so show me.
Right, but I listened to what your leader had to say today. It's not just we'll work with you on the things from your platform that we agree with. There's also all the things from our platform we want you to do this summer as well, right? And like I know you increase your votes and you increase your seats, but they still won the election, so they kind of get to decide where it goes, right? And I know the call is for the elimination of C-69. The argument is that you can expedite projects even with C-69 in place because there is a substitution option in there for program review, a substitution policy that you can substitute a provincial review for the federal review if it meets a certain consistent standard. That seems to be the mechanism they're going to use to fast track some of these things. Do you accept that it can be done that way, or do you think the whole thing's got to be torn down?
Well, I'm not sure. If the Prime Minister's position is that he doesn't need to get rid of C-69 to get some of these projects built, okay, well then,
show you.
Let's see how that works, because in our estimation and what we've heard from industry is that that is the impediment to getting some of these projects built. So that's why we've been calling for the repealing of C-69. If the Prime Minister thinks there is another way that's possible, I'd note that in the throne speech it says within a couple of years they're going to try to move the the approvals down
from 5 years to 2 years.
But in a couple of years from now, well, if we're in a crisis, I mean, the time to act is now.
Yeah, and they say that within 6 months they'll try to have an agreement with provinces to get alignment on these things. But it's not a lot of time and a lot to do. All right, I'll make you a deal. I'm going to try to find out tomorrow if the GST cut on homes is coming in this session, and if it is, we'll have you back.
Maybe I'll come back.
Yeah, well,
if I can get through security.
Exactly. Well, it's an open door policy here at the CBC. Ontario Conservative MP Adam Chambers. Always appreciate the time, sir. Thanks.
Thank you, David.